Good evening, everyone. If you're live, of course, you know that it is very late at night, and that's okay. If you're watching this, or rather listening to this, after the fact on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or on YouTube, you probably have no idea, but it is about midnight my time, which means that wherever you are in the world, it's probably significantly later than that, unless you're, of course, over on the Asian or Australian continents. But welcome. Thank you guys for joining, whether it be live or later on, to talk about Episode 3, Chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, depending where you are based in the world. Of course, this is the first Harry Potter book. We've already done 2 episodes talking about the first 4 chapters. We kind of group chapters together based on just general themes, and these 3 chapters are Harry's introduction to the Wizarding World and expanse then into the Wizarding World, journey to Hogwarts, and then his initiation into Hogwarts through the Sorting Hat ceremony. So we're going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking about these chapters. If you're new to the podcast, this is something we do every other Thursday or so. It'll go up, like I said, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, usually the following Friday or Saturday. If you're new to this channel, or if you have no idea what channel I'm talking about, you can go to youtube.com and find Echo Wirm or Echo Wirm Audiobooks. Both are our channels, and you can find all of our content throughout there. We do daily chapters of certain books on Echo Wirm Audiobooks, as well as our full content currently available as a recording over on the channel just known as Echo Wirm. Of course, that's worm spelt with an I. If you want chapters in advance, or you want just to support the channel in general, head on over to patreon.com/echoworm, again, worm with an I. And if you want to listen to these chapters as we go through them, or before you listen to the podcast, you're always welcome to do so. Our Harry Potter recordings are not available on YouTube for copyright purposes, but you can find them for free over on patreon.com/echoworm, or going to vimeo.com and searching for Echoworm. There, we have all 7 books, including a re-record of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the original British version, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, as well as some of the tangential books, including Quidditch Throughout the Ages. I added an out there. I think it's just Quidditch Through the Ages. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them is coming up soon. We've already done let's see here. We've already done, trying to think what the other one is. Fantastic Beasts is coming up, and the one I'm missing is known as the Tales of Beetle the Bard. Thank you very much. With that awkward pause out of the way, let's talk about Harry Potter chapters 5, 6, and 7. So you recall when we left off last time that Harry had been receiving letters from Hogwarts, and Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia were desperate for him not to read and receive them, in the opposite order preferably. And the reason being, they want normalcy in their family. Aunt Petunia has known about the Wizarding World for many a year, but now that Harry is of age, they do not want any unwanted, unnatural attention on their family. That comes in the form of Hagrid, who follows them all the way to an island in the middle of nowhere to where they are staying to try to avoid the letters. And we end last set of chapters with Hagrid basically promising to take Harry to the Wizarding World. So that's where we pick up here. Chapter 5, Diagon Alley. So Harry wakes up, and in this chapter, he, throughout the book so far, has had just dreams in general. He's had nightmares where he relives what he thought was his parents' car crash. Of course, now he knows that they were, in fact, murdered by Voldemort. And I do want to pause here and mention, if you are new to this book, we try not to do major spoilers even for this book specifically. We won't do anything really going forward throughout the series until we get there. We'll hint at some stuff maybe. The only exception in this chapter may be just kind of hinting at the truth of certain characters. So if you have not read the entirety of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, then you may want to do so before we talk about these chapters, because we can't really dive into how brilliant the introductions are of these characters and the foreshadowing of some of these characters without somewhat spoiling where their characters go in this story. So, with that out of the way, we start with Harry's dream. He has another dream where he thinks that the whole interaction with Hagrid didn't happen. He's worried that it didn't happen. But then he wakes up, he sees Hagrid there, and he is overjoyed that for once in his life something is going his way. So they head off, they head back to mainland England, and their first stop is to go to London. Now, it's hinted that they went to London earlier in the book with the zoo, not necessarily clear, but they stop at a pub called the Leaky Cauldron. Now, this is a special entrance from the Muggle world into the Wizarding world. It's just kind of this rundown pub. We see it several times throughout the rest of the series. Specifically, the one I'm thinking of is the beginning of the third book, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. We see the Leaky Cauldron fairly excessively in the beginning of that book. But it's a pub and an inn where once they get there to transport themselves into part of the magical world, Harry comes across something very interesting that is significantly different than his experiences in his life so far. And that is that up to this point, Harry has always been an afterthought. He has always been the second unwanted child in the Dursley household. And now, starting with this chapter, Harry realizes that he is famous, and not just famous, but like significantly famous in the eyes of the Wizarding world. And so when he gets to this pub, and Hagrid basically introduces him to all of these people who are curious who Hagrid is bringing through to Diagon Alley, Harry goes through a line of people, just lining up to shake his hand and meet him and thank him, and basically politics his way into getting some of these relationships with people who are desperate to meet him for the sake of their own popularity. A couple different characters in this pop up later in the series, but the one big interaction to note in the Leaky Cauldron here is Professor Quirrell. So Professor Quirrell is introduced to us as a very, very shy, very, very nervous individual who in this specific scene is, and this is notable going forward, this will be our first of the spoilers, in this chapter he is able to touch Harry, and the big thing that goes along with that is he is not wearing his turban. So later on, we'll talk about in this set of chapters, he reappears wearing a turban. But the thing to note here that is different than in the films is in this chapter, he shakes Harry's hand and is not wearing his turban, which tells us that this takes place before the big event, the big change in his life that we learn about going forward in the rest of the book. Something that is very significant for his character has not happened yet. He has probably met that person. In fact, we know he has met that person already because this is the very day that a big crime happens. But the thing that he fails at doing has not yet happened, and therefore he is not having to hide his face or hide his head by any means, and he is still able to touch Harry Potter. But he is putting on the act of stuttering all of the time. It's notable. He can hardly talk. And this is different from how he was previously. So it's not necessarily stated outright in these set of chapters, but Professor Quirrell was previously a professor at Hogwarts. I'm not exactly sure how long he did teach at Hogwarts, but prior to the 1990 school year, now keep in mind this is taking place in 1991, prior to the 1990 school year, he was the Muggle Studies professor, which is a course at Hogwarts where the Wizarding students basically learn about the Muggle world. So they can learn Muggle art, or they can learn Muggle history, or various things about the non-Wizarding world. He was that professor. The year prior to this book taking place, he decided to take a long-term sabbatical and take the year off from teaching and go off and do something that we'll talk about later on in this book. We won't spoil it now. But he came back, his personality had completely changed, and he seemed to be not necessarily himself. But the big difference for him, and will be big going forward for the rest of the series, is he's no longer teaching Muggle studies. He has now picked up the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts, which is basically for those of you that don't know the Wizarding world or Harry Potter's classes, Defense Against the Dark Arts is essentially their almost, almost like a phy-ed mixed with obviously a defense class, and learning just about the world and kind of the darkness of the world. There's not really an analogy in the Muggle world or any of our classes, but I guess it's a mix of biology, zoology, just all of the dark things about the wizarding world are brought into a class where they learn how to defend against that. But there is a thing about not just the class, but the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher that will be significant going forward in the series. And so it is very specifically important that we note that he was previously not the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, that now he is taking that position, and we'll see how long he lasts in said position. But that is the interaction at the Leaky Cauldron. Hagrid escorts Harry to the back, taps on some bricks, and all of a sudden, Harry sees his first glimpse of the actual wizarding world in a location called Diagon Alley. Now, of course, this is a pun on the phrase, or the word diagonally. Diagon Alley, if I'm not mistaken, was based in its concept on a marketplace in England called the Leadenhall Market. I have been there in person. In fact, I was just there over the summer. And it's this really ornate, beautiful marketplace. Has been there for, I want to say, 100 to 200 years, just north of 20 Fenchurch in the city of London. And it's got this just whimsical quality to it. It's got like red and white stripes, almost like a barber shop. It's got gold, just glimmering ornate designs and accents to the window frames and the framing of the archways itself. And it's this really, really cool location. And that is kind of what Diagon Alley is. It's this big marketplace, obviously accessible only to the wizarding world. It's in the middle of London, but it's masked by magic. And they enter it through this Leaky Cauldron pub and use magic to get through this wall. And all of a sudden, Harry is surrounded by magic and wizards. And this time of year specifically, families that are going shopping for school supplies. And so they first decide to travel to Gringotts, which is kind of the big building at the end of Diagon Alley. Gringotts is a wizarding bank. It is run by goblins, who are not so nice to Harry and Hagrid when they enter. But they need money for Harry to buy his school supplies. And this is where we get the first indication that Harry is filthy, stinking rich. Never knew it growing up. If he actually makes note of it here and in later books, specifically Half-Blood Prince, I think he recalls, when he receives gifts out of a certain person's will, he notes that had Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia known how much money he actually had, or his family had, they would have tried to get at it. But the reason for Harry's wealth, and it's not really stated here, and I actually don't know if it's ever mentioned in the series. Certainly there are articles that have been written about it by J.K. Rowling through her blog website. But Harry's father, who was a wizard, his father, or Harry's paternal grandfather, was a potions master. And with that, created basically an anti-balding serum, which made him loads of money. And Harry is the sole recipient of all of that wealth. And so Harry is beyond wealthy. This will come into effect and mentioned throughout the series for the sake of who he also meets in these set of chapters. We'll talk about that. But Harry gets money from his vault. But then Hagrid decides to take Harry along to another vault. This is vault number 713, or 713. And this is where things start to get mysterious. And the big thing to note about Harry Potter is, of course, it's a children's fantasy series, but each Harry Potter novel is a mystery novel at its core. The genre that Harry Potter is, specifically, in its form, is a mystery novel. And the first mystery that we get in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, is what is inside Vault 713. Because compared to Harry's, there's nothing in it. Harry's was packed with gold and silver and bronze. But when they open Vault 713, there's a single little tiny package. Harry has no idea what it is. Hagrid grabs it, hides it in his clothes, and tells Harry not to ask about it. And then they leave. And it's left at that. So then Hagrid takes Harry over to Madame Malkin's, which is the robe shop. He gets his school uniform. And then Hagrid disappears. And in the store, Harry meets, for the first time, a boy named Draco Malfoy. Now, of course, if you've only ever seen the films, this is not in the films. The first meeting between Draco Malfoy and Harry takes place in the film at Hogwarts. But in the store, Draco Malfoy is getting fitted for his robes, and Harry starts up a conversation with this boy and starts to learn things about the Wizarding World that he didn't know from Hagrid already, such as Hogwarts and their house system. We'll talk about the house system when we get to the Sorting Hat. But Malfoy comes across as, first, very intelligent, and then as the conversation goes on, and he basically exposes things about the Wizarding World to Harry, such as the concept of the houses at Hogwarts, the sport of Quidditch, which Harry knows nothing about. He comes across as very arrogant. And specifically, when Hagrid reappears, he had gone to buy things for Harry that Harry didn't have time to buy himself. They separated here. When he returns, Hagrid is waiting outside, and Draco Malfoy makes a comment about Hagrid basically being a servant at Hogwarts, being a slave at Hogwarts, being a dumb brute of a human being. And Harry decides in that moment that he does not like Draco Malfoy. And then Malfoy makes a snide comment about if he were sorted into Hufflepuff, he would want to leave the school. And Harry basically decides at that point that Draco Malfoy is the worst human being in the world, and he wants to be nothing like him. So if Draco Malfoy is in Slytherin, I want to be anywhere except Slytherin. And maybe not Hufflepuff. He mentions that to Hagrid as well. Houses aside, we'll talk about that in a second. But he returns to Hagrid after meeting Draco Malfoy. And Harry gets really insecure about the fact that he knows nothing about the Wizarding World. And so he starts asking Hagrid about things like Quidditch. He starts asking about things like Hogwarts. And then Hagrid takes Harry to Ollivander's, which you will know if you've seen the films and if you've been to Orlando or Hollywood or wherever else they do Harry Potter wand fittings. But this is the wand shop. They are wand creator. Mr. Garrick Ollivander himself is a character that returns several times in the series, is very, very impactful to the final book. But without spoiling things, Ollivander is a wand maker. And so he has Harry try a number of magic wands. You see this in the film. And he repeatedly stresses the phrase, "The wand chooses the wizard." And Harry doesn't quite understand what this means, but every time he flicks a wand, something bad happens or something that he doesn't mean to happens. He breaks things, things fly off the shelf. And then, as we see in the film, Ollivander decides to give Harry a wand made from holly. It's got a phoenix feather as its core. And it works for him. Sparks shoot out from it, which is the sign of it being compatible with Harry. And Harry finally feels like a wand is listening to him, essentially. And then Ollivander makes probably the most impactful statement in this entire chapter. And that is that the phoenix feather in Harry's wand has a twin. Or the phoenix that we later learn belongs to Albus Dumbledore, gave a second feather to be made into a wand. And that wand belongs to Voldemort, which is the very wand that gave Harry his scar. And so Ollivander makes a comment that it's very curious that the other side of the phoenix would choose Harry when the other one was the one that caused his physical appearance and his life so much damage then. And so Harry ends the chapter curious and insecure and worried about his own popularity. And then it's interesting because as we move into chapter 6, it's not the case as in the film. This chapter doesn't take place the day before Harry leaves. He actually goes back to his aunt and uncle's for basically an entire month. And so he stays back with the Dursleys, and they are super unpleasant to him. And finally, the day before he's supposed to leave for Hogwarts, he asks Uncle Vernon to take him back to London. And a big argument breaks out, whatever. Finally, he agrees to do so, because Harry has his wand, has his magical items, and the Dursleys are kind of feeling threatened by Harry and his presence now that he knows that he's a wizard. And so Uncle Vernon takes him up there, and he arrives at King's Cross Station, which is an actual train station in the north of London. I mentioned my trip to London recently. My wife and I were just there. We stopped at King's Cross, excuse me. Side tangent, platform 9 3/4 is said to take place between, or said to exist between the platforms of 9 and 10. If you go there in person, you'll notice that you can't go between the platforms from an odd number to an even number, because that's not the way that the trains are lined up. Because trains 1 and 2 are beside each other, which means that their platforms of platform 2 and 3 are beside each other, which means that either this would have to be between platforms 8 and 9 or platforms 10 and 11, which ignores the fact that there are only 8 platforms there at King's Cross Station. 9 and 10, or excuse me, it might be 1 through 9, but platform 10 at least, I know, is in a separate building. So this is a little bit of a if you know the actual logistics of King's Cross Station, it doesn't make any sense. But suspend your disbelief and pretend that 9 and 10 have a shared platform, in the middle of which you actually see there, are brick arches holding up the roof of King's Cross Station. And Harry learns, with the help of a family passing by, that in order to get to platform 9 3/4, you have to run through the bricks, which causes for some anxiety for Harry. But before we get to that point, it's interesting to note that the family Harry overhears, which is later introduced as the Weasleys, Molly Weasley, their mother, is asking out loud. She has a line here where she basically asks her kids what number the platform is, which is interesting because in canon, Molly Weasley spent 7 years at Hogwarts, and you would think that with the train being canonically as old as it is, with the station being as old as it is, with Molly Weasley presumably spending all 7 of her years traveling back and forth from London through King's Cross, through platform 9 3/4, because the platform number never changes. Why doesn't she remember the number? And there's not really an answer to this. It's just an interesting thing to note when you're reading the book. You're like, why doesn't she know the actual number of the platform? It never changes. But Harry meets the Weasley family. Family of red-haired children. They have 5 kids there in person. There's 7 total. 2 of them are already graduated, as we learn. The oldest is Percy. Percy is a bit of a snob. In this book specifically, I believe he's a 5th year. He is on his way to becoming prefect, or will eventually be head boy of Hogwarts. And then younger than him by 2 years are Fred and George, who are returning for their 3rd year. They are twins. And then the one that is Harry's age is their son, Ron. And then, of course, they have a daughter who is not yet of Hogwarts age named Ginny, who we will learn more about as the series goes forward. But they teach Harry how to run through. He runs through, goes off on his own, is a little bothered by the fact that as soon as he disappears from them, he overhears them talking about the fact that, oh, good Lord, I've just met Harry Potter. Harry is starting to already get sick of the fame that his life is bringing him now that he's in the wizarding world. And later on, the Weasleys return to Harry because he finds a compartment all by himself, and Ron has nowhere to go. So Ron, the one Harry's age, decides to sit with him. And that is how we meet who will go on to be Harry's best friend, Ron Weasley. Then they're interrupted, and this is kind of verbatim what happens in the film. Then they are interrupted by Hermione Granger. And Hermione Granger is very similar in personality to Draco Malfoy in terms of she's a know-it-all. The difference being everything that she does comes from kind of an altruistic perspective where she wants everything to be right with the world the way that she sees it, which is kind of true for Malfoy too, but Hermione always wants the best for other people, despite coming off as snobbish and arrogant as she does. Whereas Malfoy obviously comes from the background he does, which we'll talk about more in Chamber of Secrets, where his backstory is expanded upon further. But the interesting thing to note about Hermione, very similarly to Harry, is that she comes from the Muggle world. Now, unlike Harry, who we learn later in the book, his parents were wizards. Hermione's parents are not wizards. They're dentists. And that's something that is brought up again and again because she's very insecure about her teeth. Hermione is described as having very bushy hair and very, very long buck teeth, and is not very, for lack of better phrase to call an 11-year-old, not very attractive from the perspective of other 11-year-olds. But she introduces herself looking for another kid's pet toad. Now, the Hogwarts items letter, the supplies letter that Harry gets, says that you can bring an owl, a cat, or a toad to Hogwarts. This student has a toad, and his name is Neville Longbottom. Now, we don't really meet him specifically here, but it's interesting to note how he's introduced as just kind of this klutz who everything goes wrong for him. His toad abandons him. He's already failing at the Wizarding World type of stuff prior to even getting to Hogwarts. And so Hermione is trying to help him find his toad. But Ron has a pet rat, and his name is Scabbers. And we won't spoil anything for that at all yet. That's something to talk about as we move into the third book. But when Hermione arrives, Ron is trying to show off a little bit of magic that his brothers tried to show him prior to leaving for Hogwarts. And so he tries to turn his rat yellow. It doesn't work. He's very embarrassed. Hermione introduces herself, basically realizes who Harry Potter is, says that she's done all of this reading. She is so well prepared herself for the Wizarding World, whatever. And Harry kind of decides that he doesn't really like her either. Very similar to his attitude with Malfoy. Train goes on. Finally, they arrive at Hogsmeade Station. And from there, all of the first years are separated from the bunch and go with Hagrid, who reappears. And Hagrid brings them across the lake to Hogwarts. There's a huge lake that separates Hogsmeade Station from the castle of Hogwarts. You'll know this if you've played Hogwarts Legacy, the video game. And they take the boats over to Hogwarts Castle. And the chapter ends here with Hagrid knocking on the front doors of the castle. Now, in the film model, and in the model that is used basically for the franchise, there isn't really a front door to the castle, so it's not entirely clear where this location is. I've always imagined that this probably takes place... They do mention grass, so it could either take place at the Bell Tower courtyard entrance, or it could take place at the entry hall entrance outside the Great Hall. It's not entirely clear. The castle's very different in the books than it is in the films and the video game. But that's how we end the 6th chapter. That chapter is called The Journey from Platform 9 3/4. And we move on to chapter 7, which is the final chapter that we will talk about today. And this is titled The Sorting Hat. So we've been introduced to the Wizarding World. We've been introduced to the concept of Hogwarts. Now it's time to meet the castle itself, and specifically how things operate. So when I read this book, I had no idea what a house was. Now, granted, I'm an American. I grew up prior to middle school having no idea about houses in schools. This is a very common thing in Britain, especially in boarding schools, where you are basically separated to live and take classes with basically a smaller community than you have at the school as a whole, or in your grade as a whole. Now, if you're from the United States, I don't know if there are any analogs in Canada or Australia or wherever you're from. In the United States, we have, in the last 10, 15 years, shifted from what was called a junior high school, which is basically ages roughly 11 through 14, 15. We have shifted from a junior high school into now what is called a middle school system. And with middle school, what is different from junior high school, where you're just kind of going around to different classes, you were separated into, when I went, they were called teams. I know some schools call them pods or even houses. But they basically divide your grade up into smaller sections. And this allows you to adjust better as you move from a single classroom type school to a multiple classroom or multiple subject type school. It's a transition period. And so in America, these houses would be very similar to your middle school teams or your middle school pods. But being that Hogwarts is a boarding school, of course, they also live together. They have very specific locations in the castle and very specific priorities. So kind of the misconception with the houses at Hogwarts is that it's a personality test. For the longest time, the films kind of amplify this, and it's a brilliant marketing strategy. But people kind of see the Hogwarts houses as, if you have this type of personality, you belong in this house, or this house, or this house. That's not actually the case. Because by that logic, everything about Hermione, and what we know about Hermione, is that she would probably then either be a Slytherin, or specifically a Ravenclaw, which is, it kind of hinted later on in the series to be her secondary priority there. But the sorting hat does not sort you by your personality. The sorting hat, and we see this with Harry, the sorting hat takes into consideration your strengths, but where you are sorted in your house is not based on your personality or your strengths. It is based on where you prioritize your strengths. And so the reason that you get someone who is stereotypically lazy, like a Hufflepuff, in Ron, and you get someone who is ambitious and outgoing, I don't know. Harry fits the Gryffindor model pretty well. But then, like I said, with Hermione, the intelligence moving her towards Ravenclaw, the reason that all three of them aren't placed in those separate houses is because they prioritize their own self-worth, and in specifically bravery and courage and friendship, which is what Gryffindor, the historical Godric Gryffindor who founded the house, prioritized. So it's not based on your personality. And the films do a very, very poor job at separating these things, because especially as we get later on in the series, Slytherins are always kind of portrayed as being evil, or just always being a very specific type of person. That's not always the case. Hagrid does mention that there wasn't a bad witch or wizard who wasn't in Slytherin. This isn't specifically true, but this is the stereotype, because of the fact that a lot of dark witches and wizards prioritize their own self-worth, or their own cunning, or their own ambition. That is why they are placed in Slytherin, because that is what they themselves prioritize in themselves. If Hermione was more proud of her intelligence, which outwardly to some people she might be, but internally she has always prioritized her own bravery and courage and whatnot, and that is why she specifically is placed in Gryffindor. That's what the sorting hat is. Now, what's different in this scene compared to in the films is, first of all, the sorting hat has a lot more personality than we see in the films. Specifically, at the beginning of every year, and we don't really see this for the next few, there's some things that happen where Harry doesn't really see the sorting hat ceremony until his 4th year going forward. But the sorting hat always has a song. The sorting hat always sings. Now, if you guys haven't listened to my version of the audiobook, I did my best to do a sorting hat song that I am proud of. But the sorting hat sings, basically setting up either the ceremony itself, or going forward, if there are things happening around the school or around the wizarding world, he sings about those things. And so we have that here, which isn't in the film. And the other thing to note before we talk about the sorting ceremony, or it does take place after, but Harry notes that Quirrell is wearing a turban. And he looks really, really odd in it. And, of course, we who have read the rest of the book understand what has happened and changed in Quirrell's life for why he now decides to wear a turban. Harry also learns of the appearance of, or the presence of, a professor who strikes him as not being a very nice guy. And his name is Professor Snape. And we'll talk about Snape very, very specifically in the next chapter. Snape is a very important character for the series, but we're introduced to him here. Harry is kind of distracted by the way that Snape is looking at him, and this is also where we get the first instance of Harry's scar hurting. So Harry's scar causing him physical discomfort and pain in the presence of Snape throughout this book and other characters going forward first appears here. And it's very interesting when it happens in this chapter. It's when Snape is having a conversation with Quirrell. So keep that in the back of your head going forward. Then, of course, we have the sorting ceremony itself. Now, Harry has a larger class that, as is shown in the film, of course, they cut that scene for time. But J.K. Rowling also didn't create that many characters in the book. And so Harry's class is fairly small for what you'd expect of a school as large as Hogwarts. But we see people sorted into Ravenclaw, we see people sorted into Hufflepuff, we see people sorted into Slytherin, and of course we see people sorted into Gryffindor. We get the introduction of characters such as, ones going forward, of course, we see Lavender Brown, we see Seamus Finnegan, Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, all of these various characters. And in succession then, of course, Hermione, Harry, and Ron are all sorted into Gryffindor. Harry is reintroduced to the Weasley family, and then he's introduced to the House Ghosts, specifically the one for Gryffindor House, Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, otherwise known as Nearly Headless Nick, who is a more significant character going forward in the books than he is in the films. Of course, John Cleese famously played him in the first 2 films, and then he doesn't really appear going forward. His role is significantly cut back, and then he really just doesn't appear at all. And then other house ghosts as well, the Fat Friar for Hufflepuff, the Bloody Baron for Slytherin. And then it's not, she's never really named, and we don't really get any interaction with her until the final book, but the Ravenclaw ghost is known as the Grey Lady. There are plenty of other ghosts around the castle as well, and we also get Peeves the Poltergeist, who, for the life of me, I do apologize, I can't remember if he's introduced in this chapter, but I definitely know he makes an appearance in the next chapter. But that's kind of where we end things. Harry is sorted into Gryffindor House and is then transported off to Gryffindor Tower, which is the common room area, the living area for Gryffindor House. And he gets ready to fall asleep, worrying that this is all going to be another one of those dreams that he wakes up from. But then he falls asleep, and he has a dream about Voldemort and Malfoy and of Snape, and he doesn't really understand it. But then the chapter ends basically saying that when he woke up, he didn't remember the dream at all. And so we kind of get this premonition where another mystery is set up. It's like, okay, is this foreshadowing something? Is this a red herring? We assume it has to come back, Occam's razor and all those kind of writing concepts. But that's where we end things, is Harry is safe and sound at Hogwarts Castle, having been initiated into the wizarding world. And so that's where we end things here. Going forward, of course, next, in 2 weeks, we will return to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, talking about Harry's classes and the first few months at Hogwarts. So if you guys ever have any questions or things you want answered, if you're on YouTube, you are more than welcome to ask things in the live chat. If you catch this live, if you catch it afterward, you're more than welcome to leave comments, and we will address them on the channel. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, of course, you can always reach out. Email at echowirm, worm spelled with an I, at gmail.com, and we will get those back to you. You can also join our Discord server. There are links on, I believe, both channels now. If not, feel free to comment, and we can get you in contact if you want to join our community there. But that's all I have today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again for the next episode of the podcast very, very soon.